So let's just start right off the bat. What is a recession? Well, a recession is a macroeconomic term, meaning it is a term that is about the larger economy, not specific small things that may be occurring, but the economy as a whole. It's a macroeconomic term that refers to a significant decline in general economic activity in a designated region. In this case, we are talking about United States recessions. We're talking about our country having recessions. It has typically been recognized as 2 consecutive quarters of economic decline as reflected by GDP in conjunction with monthly indicators such as rises in unemployment. So what does that mean, right? There might have been a few things there that kind of got you off track. So it has typically been seen as 2 consecutive quarters. So 2 consecutive quarters would be like from January to the beginning of July, right? 2 quarters of a year, or maybe, it rolls into another year, but at least 2 consecutive quarters, right, of economic decline as reflected by GDP. Well, what is GDP? GDP is gross domestic product. Now, this is the sum of all the goods and services that are produced or rendered within the United States in a given year, right? So the GDP is our major measure, albeit maybe not the best measure, but it is the most widely accepted measure of economic productivity that there is. And we look at whether or not GDP has grown over these quarters, right? Every quarter, it's very important. You watch CNBC, you watch any other business news channel, they are always interested in what the Federal Reserve has to say about GDP growth. We're really interested in what GDP growth is and how it compares to quarters past for us, how it compares to years past for us, how it compares to other countries that we are actively competing with. And so 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth would be what we're talking about here with the recession definition that we're going to work by. And so this means for 2 consecutive quarters, your economy got smaller in terms of the amount of goods and services that were produced or rendered within that economy. So the National Bureau of Economic Research, which officially declares recessions, says that 2 consecutive quarters of decline in real GDP are not how a recession should be defined anymore. And that is widely agreed upon. The NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, defines a recession as a significant decline in economic activity spread across the economy lasting more than a few months, normally visible in real GDP, real income, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales. And so they make it a more all-inclusive definition, and they make it not just a hard and fast rule of negative GDP growth, which is still likely going to coincide with their definition of what a recession is, but it's not just holding it to that specific standard. And so we see these are what recessions are. These are contractions in our economy. You're either expanding or you are contracting, and recessions are these contractions in our overall economy. Now, recessions work alongside expansion, and obviously expansions are a lot longer in time period because growth continues a lot longer than the recession of a specific country, specifically ours, which has been a world power for a long time, does. But if you look at expansions and you say, okay, how long do expansions last? Because you see, in order to call something a recession, we're talking, more than a few months, a couple of quarters, something that may last a year, maybe more, but that would be a long recession, right? But if you have one of these recessions, they're followed typically by expansions. And the longest expansion is actually one that we just got done with, right? The expansion from June of 2009 all the way until February of 2020, right? This was a 128-month expansion, which is the longest economic expansion we've had in the United States in the last century. And it was only brought down by something that was not, even part of the system in the first place. It was external. It was an exogenous event. COVID-19 was an exogenous event that brought down that economy into a recession, which this is one reason why I think it's important to talk about what recessions are today, because a recession has been something that we have been dealing with when it has come to, high unemployment, the economy contracting because of COVID-19 and things of the like. And so recessions are really important to understand in that way. So let's understand them a little better. So since the Industrial Revolution, the long-term macroeconomic trend in most countries has been economic growth. Obviously, because that Industrial Revolution brought a lot of new machinery, a lot of new tools, a lot of new jobs, a lot of new things that people could do in order to increase economic growth over time. Okay. Along with this long-term growth, however, there have been short-term fluctuations when major economic indicators have shown slowdowns or even outright declining performance over time frames of 6 months up to several years. Before returning to their long-term growth trend, these short-term declines are known as recessions. Okay, so these short-term fluctuations, these short-term downward corrections of economies, or these recessionary times, they are relatively common. They do occur, and they do occur more often than we would like to think. Yes, we have seen two, let's say in the last 12 years or so, that have been quite major and quite significant. And the reason that the past two have been quite major, quite significant, is because obviously there was the Great Recession, which was the 07 through 09 recession, and that was something that was bigger than any recession we had seen since the Great Depression. But obviously we saw the COVID-19 pandemic hit, which is extremely significant, which caused a recession as well. And so we have this big, scary boogeyman thought about recessions. And yes, recessions can be extremely negative, but it does not mean that they are not a normal part of our business cycles. They are a normal part of business cycles. Expansions and contractions both occur.